So thanks a lot, James, for this kind introduction, and thanks everyone for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to be with you, although virtually, of course. But hopefully we can enjoy a conversation together. Now, as James was saying, degrowth obviously is very controversial, and this is the idea. This is the point. So degrowth was launched as an activist slogan by environmental activists in France at the beginning of the year 2000. Why? Well, because they were not happy with mainstream proposals such as the one of sustainable development, which basically was around this center idea that economic growth is compatible with ecological sustainability. So they wanted to put forward a more radical proposal. So if you want, degrowth also comes from debates from the 70s already on the limits to growth, on the ecological limits to growth, with which I guess you are familiar. But it also has other sources. It also comes, for instance, from what is called post-development, a cultural critique of the mainstream concept of development. And the critique goes along like the idea that development is a concept generated in the global north and that it is imposed upon other countries. So the idea that there is a universal direction, objective, which is the same for everyone, for every community, every state in the world is obviously controversial because there is a lot of diversity. So what we are seeing is the emergence of alternatives to development or to sustainable development. Degrowth is one among many others. We could mention buen vivir in Latin America, for example, but is the one that emerged in Europe and is the one that concerns us today. James, maybe if you can mute your mic, because we can hear.
Sure.
But sorry about that. So, so again about degrowth. So what is degrowth? So first of all, I said it was launched as a provocative slogan when everyone is in favor of growth, politicians, economists, journalists. Growth is the panacea, right? With growth, we can solve any problem. Gender equality, poverty, inequalities, climate change, you just name it. So if you want to be provocative, then you can say degrowth. Obviously, we are not saying that we are not claiming for the decrease of GDP. We say GDP, gross domestic product, is a problematic indicator. So we say we should be ignoring it. And instead, if we want to put at the center of our society things like equity and sustainability and the well-being of people, those should be the focus of our society, not whether GDP goes up or down, right? So degrowth very quickly became a frame for a new social movement and also a concept debated in academia. So right now there are more than, I don't know, 10 special issues, 400 or 500 academic articles, probably about 15 or 20 books and so on. So there is almost 20 years old debate. So degrowth in this sense is two things at the same time. On one end is a critique of the hegemony of growth, the idea that with economic growth we can solve all the problems. And on the other end is a proposal for a different society where we could prosper without growth, right? A lot of debates in these last 2 decades have focused more on the set of questions which have to do, if you want, with the diagnosis. So what are the social problems, who are responsible for them, and so on and so forth. So a little bit more on the analysis side. And now the debate is moving more towards the strategies. So what we could call the prognosis. What has to be done? How are we going to do it? Who is going to do it? And for whom are we going to do it? So a little bit more on the strategies and the actors. So if you want, this book, our last book, The Case for Degrowth, goes a little bit more about the politics of degrowth, the politics of the transition. How do we get from here to there, right? So this was like a little bit of an introduction. I'll talk about the book. In these years, we have done many other things. There are biennial international conferences. This year, there is one taking place in Manchester, which is together with the International Society of Ecological Economics. We have been running here in Barcelona, where I'm based, a summer school for 10 years. We have a master program on political ecology, degrowth, and environmental justice. So there's a lot more places and instances where you can get to know more about degrowth, right? But let's focus now upon the book. The case for degrowth is a case for living simply so that others might simply live. This quote has been attributed to Gandhi, but we have checked and this is actually not true. So I don't know to whom it belongs, but it's a nice one and I like it. So our book is a case for reducing production and consumption in the global north, especially among the rich, north and south. My case for degrowth consists of 4 arguments and 1 rebuttal. And if you want, this is the structure of my talk today. First, I will argue that the current crisis is not a crisis of lack of growth, but of unbearable social and environmental sacrifices in the altar of growth. Second, I will explain how degrowth must be rooted on different ways of being and relating for shortland, simplicity, and the commons. Third, I will present 5 core policies crucial for a transition towards degrowth. And fourth, I will explain how I see the politics of degrowth as an articulation between the personal, the communal, and the political or the institutional. And then last, I will close responding to 3 common objections to degrowth. First, that degrowth is unnecessary since green growth can do the job. Second, that degrowth is unjust since the global south and the poor need growth. And third, that degrowth is politically impossible. So let me start with the sacrifices in the pursuit of growth. This is a graph of global GDP growing 3% each year. This is how it looks like. Compare 2018 to 2100. Compound growth is the madness of economic reasons, geographer David Harvey wrote. Indeed. As we joke in the book, to an archaeologist in the future, our civilization obsession with growth will seem as strange as that of ancient Greeks worshipping 12 gods on a mountain top who masquerade as bulls to have sex, and more deadly than the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of humans on Aztec's pyramids, right? Consider the austerity cuts to keep overdeveloped economies growing, the demolition of health and education infrastructure that took so much effort to build, and we see the consequences right now in the midst of a pandemic. The unprecedented debt to keep consumer consuming, the rich rich, and economies afloat. Let's talk about debt. World debt hit a record high of 247 trillion in the first quarter of 2018, an 11% year-on-year increase. Between 2009 and 2019, the European Central Bank pumped almost 2.6 trillion into banks and the US over 4 trillion. This money ended up on the pockets of the rich, and from there to stocks and housing. Housing prices skyrocketed, and common people can no longer afford to live in city centers. In the 100 cities worldwide, like Saskasassin argue, corporate buying of existing properties exceeded 600 billion from mid-2013 to mid-2014, and 1 trillion a year later. San Francisco, one of the world's richest cities, is in the midst of a feces crisis. Poor people without homes defecate in the streets because they don't have houses. Now, let's talk about nature. Nature is also sacrificed in the altar of growth. Plot any graph of a global environmental impact, be it carbon dioxide, water use, ocean acidification, waste dumping, you can see them in the graph. And you will find a hockey stick figure like that of GDP. This is not a coincidence. This is what scientists call acceleration. Acceleration of GDP is what accelerates environmental impacts. Now, 145 scientists from 50 countries writing for the 2019 UN report on biodiversity and ecosystem services conclude that nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. For instance, bird population across the French countrysides have fallen by a third over the past 15 years. 3.5 million bees colonies have been lost in the US from the 6 billion counting in 1947. Now, if all countries were to meet, for example, their commitments in the Paris Agreement, global temperature would still increase as a disastrous 3 degrees. IPCC climate models square growth with 1.5 degrees only by assuming, as you can see in the figure, unproven and untested bioenergy with carbon capture to take carbon out of the atmosphere. Tellingly, the only IPCC model that doesn't involve fast energy decrease, and in the graph is the first one on the left, the one called P1. The other ones, P2, P3, and P4, incorporate afforestation in brown and carbon capture and storage in yellow. So I won't go on more on the environmental impacts because we are very much familiar with them. We want to see what we can do about that. So we should be reaching out, as Walter Benjamin said, the emergency brake. He put it before the Second World War, but I think it works also for today. But then the question is, how do we do this? How do we pull the emergency brake? That is the subject of the rest of our book and really the core of it. Now, to think what is to be done, one needs to start from those who are already doing things differently, those who live simply to let others simply live. So let me give a few examples. Think of Pope Francis, who eschewed the palatial papal residence in favor of an austere suite, or the former president of Uruguay, Pepe Mujica, who lived at his humble farm on the outskirts of Montevideo, donating 90% of his presidential salary. Another example could be Winona LaDuke, a Harvard-trained economist who twice ran for the US presidency with the Green Party, living most of her life modestly on the OSB White Earth Reservation in Minnesota, while fighting against oil pipelines. In fact, recently in November, when we were supposed to present the book along with Winona, she couldn't join because she had got arrested in her fights against these oil pipelines. Now, innumerable others among us practice modest living, not only famous people. And these include, for instance, city folks who find contentment in work, family, or friends without striving for ever greater wealth and power, farmers who produce enough to reproduce their community without exhausting natural resources, and pensioners dedicated to community work. Or, for example, my mother-in-law who is taking care of my son right now, otherwise I would not be able to be here with you. Now, the prevalent ideology wants us to think we are each on our own, that it is our own nature to want more and more, that everyone wants to live like a rich Westerner, that there is no alternative to capitalism. None of this is true. Evolutionary biologists and economists tell us that humans have multiple potentials. We are selfish, but we are also altruist. We desire more, but we also live content with less. We want our own things, but we also share generously. It is our institutions that reward some propensities and reprimand others. And institutions change. Importantly, we only survive and advance by cooperating. We are a cooperative society. No baby can go far in life alone, not my son, for instance. It is naive, of course, to think that change is a matter of personal volition. This is why in the book we look at the relationship between the personal, the communal, and the political. No matter how simple or slow you might want to be, if you can't if you live in a North American suburb like the one you see in the pictures and work miles from home. Car driving is the only option. If you live in Copenhagen, surrounded by beautiful bike paths, it is easier to cycle to work or school, together with 50% of the population. Now, conducive environments co-evolve with personal desires and habits, networks, and changing institutions. As people come together to do things differently, they also organize politically to defend and assist their way of living and being. People are already doing things differently. As feminist economist Gibson Graham argued, the capitalist economy is just the tip of an iceberg sustained by immense voluntary, reciprocal, and not-for-profit activity. And this is what we call to look upon. Often in the form of what we call the commons, people working with one another and sharing resources for a common purpose, right? Now, the commons, in the way we understand them in our book, are not only cooperatively governed forests, fisheries, or aquifers, like the ones that the Nobel Prize Ostrom studied, but also shared urban spaces, open software, festivities, community gardens, and occupied squares that are studied, for example, by David Bollier and Silke Elfrich in this book, The Wealth of the Commons. Against pushes to privatize and commodify the commons, movement have defended and reclaimed commons. These struggles and community economies are the roots upon which to cultivate the growth, where we can start from because they already exist. For instance, in the city of Barcelona, where I live, there are 300 cooperatives interconnected, 10,000 people, and supporting the livelihood of 6,000. If you are in Barcelona, to give you some examples, you can become a member of the cooperative Som Energia, which you can see in the picture, getting 100, and this means getting 100% renewable electricity at affordable cost. You can also share an electric car through Som Mobilidad, connect to the internet through another cooperative called Som Conexión, receive primary care through the Coast Health Cooperative, live in a co-housing unit built by the architect cooperative Sostre Civic, take turns in a parent-run childcare group, grow vegetables in community garden, buy produce food from local farmers through a consumer cooperative, of listen to the new bands in citizen-run social centers called Ateneums. Now, by participating in the economy of the commons, you produce and consume differently, and you devote your time and your resources to a parallel economy. Crucially, by being a commoner, you are part of the broader change you want to see, like the first traders and bankers in the nascence of capitalism. To put a more concrete example, for example, with my partner, we have just joined the project to set up to build what we call a feminist co-housing. So it would be a building with about 12 housing units where different families would join and live together, each of them with their own apartments, but also with shared spaces. And the reason why we call it a feminist co-housing is because the member of the cooperatives would only be the women. So the families are of different types. There are lonely women, women with children, women with partners, heterosexual like myself, or lesbians, and whatever. There are kids and old people, etc. But one interesting thing is that in this project that is just starting, only women are taking part of the decision making. Why? Because we want to try and experiment something different. We want to see, for example, how women deal with power, how they deal with leadership. So it's a social experiment, if you want. So if we want to change society, we should start building on what already exists and what we know. To move a little bit more to the institutional level, I could say, for example, that in 2015 in Barcelona, we elected in the municipal government what is called the Party for the Commons, in Catalan, Barcelona en Comú, a movement party staffed with seasoned activists from the city commons, and they're still ruling the city now for the second term. Now, Barcelona en Comú, this party, protected existing and opened up new commons. This is what co-evolutionary possibility towards degrowth look like. And we take this as a case study in our book, and we go much more into the details of what they've done. But now, if we want to move up in terms of geographical scale, what could, for example, a movement party like the one I just mentioned do if they take the state power? What could they do in a degrowth direction? And here I move on to the third part of our book, which covers these 5 what we call non-reformist reforms. And they're basically policy proposals. So let's look at them and review them quickly. Now, the first one is Green New Deal without growth, a bold investment program anywhere near 3% of GDP annually to decarbonize energy and transport, reforest, and transform agriculture. Now, 3% of GDP is what many nations spend right now for their armies, so it's feasible. Without growth, a Green New Deal could be financed by taxes, redirection of expenditure or subsidies, or state issuing money to fund expenditures with social returns as modern monetary theory supports. By circumventing banks to finance the transition, money will not enter the economy as debt, with the demand for growth to pay the interest. The second proposal we do is the one of universal care income and universal basic services. A basic income at about 20% of per capita income can be funded with an increase of the taxes of the top 15% of incomes. Simulation from Catalonia show. We call this a care income to emphasize it is given in recognition of the unpaid care work of all of us, and mostly women, without which economies could not exist. We could go back to the example of my mother-in-law taking care of my son right now. Now, economists at the London University Global Prosperity Institute have developed a plan for guaranteed housing, food, transport, and internet access that would cost the equivalent of 2.3% of the UK GDP, an amount that could be raised by eliminating two-thirds of the tax breaks currently available. The third proposal is to reduce working hours, of course, because we want to tackle the issue of unemployment. This would mean, for example, 1 day less per week. Sharing this way the available work among more people, reducing unemployment, distributing more fairly the benefits of productivity, and reducing environmental pressure. The fourth proposal is to support for the commons, which I already mentioned before. This would include municipalizing communal services such as water or energy, policies to reclaim public space for commercial use, or active support with legislation and financing of thriving social and solidarity economies. Now, the final proposal is a little bit about how do we fund all this, where do we find the money? Now, in our the final proposal, so in our program, is an overhaul of taxation and fiscal systems, tax carbon and resource use, and not work. Basically, because we want to generate more employment and we want to reduce environmental pressure. We could return the revenue from a carbon tax as dividend to poor people. We could tax high incomes more, tax wealth and transnational capital, and use the proceeds to fund equality and sustainability. We could set a maximum income. A good yardstick is the international standard wage mark already used by companies, non-profits, organizations, and government agencies to certify that the ratio between their highest and lowest earners is within a 8:1 ratio. Now, others have proposed these policies before, right? Our differences is that we conceive them as levers for a great transformation beyond growth and capitalism, socializing property and redistributing resources and time out of capital circulation. Importantly, we conceive this institution in synergy. Each alone in a growth context would change little. Resource, corporate, and wealth taxes may fund Green New Deals or basic services, relieving the pressure for growth to pay for them. Basic income or carbon dividends might stimulate consumption, but resource and carbon taxes disincentivize ecological harmful choices. Community economies, strengthened by our policies, offer outlets for creative energies liberated by reduced work hours or secured by a universal income. As economies slow down, social safeguard might make sure no one falls off the net. And by opening up the commons and increasing security, we reduce the need for growth. Now, you could argue that these policies ideas are not new, but they are too radical to stand a chance in electoral politics, more so in a degrowth direction. And this brings us to an important question, the politics of degrowth, that is basically the fourth chapter in our book. Now, we won't have policy change unless there are people who want it. This is obvious, unless we want to go for a dictatorship, obviously. And there will not be people who want it unless political institutions allow spaces where people can want different things. So an important question is here, how do we articulate then the personal with the communal and the political? In our book, we propose strategies of building new common senses, a concept we take from Antonio Gramsci through cultural changes embodied and practiced in the making and defense of commons, articulated and generalized through political movements that promote such commons. Protest, reform, and prefigurative personal and collective change are then interrelated and one needs the other. If, for example, if you stop eating meat, but the EU agricultural policy subsidizes large-scale meat industry, little will change. If, however, you also buy food from your locally sourced cooperative and you, alongside others, organize to elect government that challenge the agri-food system, something might change. So obviously I've gone a little bit quick on what is the main content of our book, but it was to give you an idea. So to summarize, we can say that we propose a transformative strategy of building new common sense slowly through deep cultural changes that are embodied and practiced in the making and defense of commons, right? So let me move now to the last part of our book in which we have a FAQ questions, the frequently asked questions about degrowth, right? There are many there. I'm just going to mention three of them, right? So the first one goes that degrowth is not necessary since we can both have growth and reduce environmental impact. So, for example, recent works like the one by Andrew McAfee in his book called More from Less, he celebrates a supposed peak material consumption pointing to reduction in domestic resource use in high incomes, which in my graph would be the red lines, alongside growth, the blue lines. So basically, he's saying that resource use is decreasing despite GDP is increasing, right? Yet, this is an artifact of globalization, because if we look at the material footprints, which is basically the green lines in my graphs, that is the total resources used to produce the goods a country consumes, total in the sense that it includes imports, then obviously the picture is quite different. In a globalized economy, footprints are best guide, and these increase with GDP, right? So gladly, 21 countries reduced their carbon footprints between 2000 and 2014, although their economies grew. But they reduced them on average 1 to 2% each year. So climate scientists estimate that high-income nations should reduce their emission by 10% each year, in line with the fair sharing of a 2 degrees carbon budget. The slower the growth, the easier to reduce emission. This is our central point. So these 21 countries that reduced emission saw also low GDP growth in the same period, close to 1% on average annual. That's what we call secular stagnation. If growth were closer to 3%, there would be hardly any reduction of emission. Now, if we look into a post-COVID recovery scenario, which I'm showing here in the graph to stay within 1.5, which is the green area, or 2 degree, which is the blue area, what can we do, right? So these scenarios that were constructed by my colleagues, Yorgos Khalid, Alyosha, and Dan O'Neill, show that even an ambitious global Green Deal, the yellow line in the graph, fails to keep global emission within 2 degrees, the blue shaded area. The only recovery path that stays within the envelope of 2 degrees IPCC path is the green line, which is combining fast decarbonization, reduced energy use, and crucially, zero GDP growth in the global north. So this is degrowth, right? Such empirical realities will not deter economists who see humans as psychic pleasure machines that can get more and more out of stuff without more demands on resources. If value translates to money, though, those who make money selling immaterial pleasure can use this money to buy material goods and services. Think of, I don't know, a yogi guru, right? Who can drive a Ferrari. Only limits on resources use will stop this, and this is what degrowth points to. Now, will capitalist growth survive such limitation? Well, good question. Capitalism has grown by exploiting cheap natures and cheapened people. To think that somehow it will still grow without them is like thinking that you could force the players of the LA Lakers to play basketball with only one end and expect that they will still win the NBA, right? So this was the first objection. The second one that I want to discuss with you is the one that degrowth condemns poor countries and people to stay poor, right? Now, to be clear, with degrowth, we address well-off people in the global north. But we do believe that degrowth in the north will relieve pressure from extraction and unequal exchange on impoverished nations. It will also open political space to those who fight for alternatives to a one-way future of Western-based development in, say, Latin America or Africa. And this is another book I edited, which is called The Pluriverse, in which we make basically an inventory of 100 alternatives to development from all over the world, which are somehow similar to the one of degrowth in Europe. Now, these people that are fighting, they should know that we levy the fight where we live and where the ideology of growth started, the West. And in this way, we open space for the pluriverse of alternatives to growth-based development that exists around the world. To claim that the North should grow out of charity for the South is a bad joke, thinking of the colonial pillage that made growth possible. As Jason Ickel reports, donor countries reappropriated 2.5 times the aid they gave developing countries through debt payments and capital flying. Growth is an ineffective mechanism for alleviating poverty. In countries like the US or the UK, around 50% of the population remains poor. This share stacks in the 1970s despite four-fold growth of the economy. The poorest 60% of humanity receive only 5% of all new income generated by global growth. At this rate, it would take 207 years to eradicate poverty at $5 a day, global GDP reaching 175 times its present size. Average income would have to be a fantastical 1 million per year so that the poorest two-thirds could earn $5 per day. You can imagine this is just nonsense. Now, the last critique I want to mention is the idea that degrowth politics are utopian, right? Indeed, people like William Rees brought that the ecological necessary might be politically impossible and the political acceptable ecologically impossible. Still, the political difficulties of degrowth do not make green growth any more possible. Granted, a transition away from growth will not happen just because we have strong arguments. Building commons and winning elections seems like also a painful, slow, and uncertain process, and the reaction should not be underestimated. Judging from the reaction to something more prosaic, like wearing masks, things do not look good. Those of us who write about degrowth realize that we cannot wish growth, and those who defend it away. Capitalist economies do depend on growth, and when there is no growth, people suffer. There are solid ideas on how economies can be stabilized without growth, or how to secure well-being. This is what our research has been on in the last 20 years. But the politics of making this idea dominant are far from easy, and here I hope to count with you. This is why I'm here with you today. And this is even more true that making this idea become truth is difficult, especially in a multipolar world driven by economic and geopolitical competition, where the economically weak are dominated by the military strong. A transition to something akin to degrowth would be messy, and it would happen, if it were ever to happen, under conditions that will not be our own choosing. As we overshoot planetary boundaries and the planet heats, we should expect more economic and social instability, with new political dangers and new political possibilities. Our responsibility as scientists is to state clearly which paths are feasible and desirable and which are not. And our task as citizens is to work with others to chart desirable paths and not digress to the barbarous business as usual holds for us. So I hope that we are together in the struggle, and thank you for your attention.
I'll give you some applause. I don't know if anybody else wants to unmute. I see some hands. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So if you have questions, please put them on the chat, or I suggest you do that because I can monitor that relatively easily. And then if you are willing to put the question yourself, you can unmute yourself. And I think that might be a productive way in which we can manage the conversation. And hopefully it's a lively conversation. So I've got an initial question here from Morris, who asks you about, do you have a view of the scale of the degrowth of material consumption required? He says, I believe 80% degrowth is required. Can you confirm that is about right? So Morris, are you talking about the kind of the dematerialization elements of degrowth?
Yeah. So James, do you want to take me to take one question one by one, or
yeah? If we start off one by one, and then as you're answering, I can do more management of the questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So that's a good point, Maurice. So I'm trained as an ecological economist. So there are different ways of accounting for biophysical flows in the economies in terms, for example, of material and energies. And these are indicators like material and flow analysis. And for example, we have this data from Eurostat, which is a good thing. There are other type of indicators also that we can use, for instance, more related to biomass and so on. The problem here is always setting and understanding what is the boundary, what is the absolute limit within which we should stay. In this sense, I think we could use the planetary boundary framework. And if you look at the work of, for example, Kate Rayford with this idea of the donut economics, there is this idea of bringing together, for instance, planetary boundary with social and economic indicators. At what level we have to stay within is difficult to say, depends where, and also we can not only talk in terms of countries, but we have to look within countries at different social groups. But obviously, for instance, in terms of energies, yes, I mean, we have to reduce our consumption by, say, 80%, you know, in a few decades, if we want to reduce CO2 emission. One of the things we explain in the book is that we cannot easily substitute, for example, fossil fuels with renewable energy, so that we need to reduce demand on electricity. But the specificity of what, how much we need to reduce of what, depends on many different variables. But if you are interested, I would invite you to see, for example, the work on what is called social metabolism, which exactly looks at the material and energy flows within the economy. For example, there is an interesting article that discusses how circular is the global economy, because you know the European Union and also China are saying that we should make our economy circular. But when you look at the empirical data, then you see that we are only recycling about 6% of the materials we use. So circular economy would mean recycling 100%. And obviously there are things like fossil fuels that cannot be recycled. Once you burn them, you have burned them, right? But yeah, that would be like a first quick reaction. I hope it helps.
Thank you very much. That actually leads quite nicely onto the second question, which was from Trish, who asked, what do you think of current circular economy concepts, especially those which focus on the extension of material life cycle? Would that be the first step to degrowth?
So I'm all in favor of a circular economy. In fact, humankind has lived in a kind of a circular economy for the majority of its existence, right? If you look, for example, at subsistence agriculture, it's clearly a circular system, right? So, but nowadays, the idea that comes, for instance, from industrial ecology and ecological economics, on this idea that we should make our economy circular, the problem is what I said before, is that a circular economy implies that we emulate ecosystems, and therefore we are recycling 100% of the energy and materials. Now, with the energy, we have a problem that fossil fuels cannot be recycled, and renewable energy have a lot of problems because, for instance, they're not as productive as fossil fuels in energy terms, and they have many other technological limits. So, for example, if you look at electric cars, they cannot travel very far and stuff like that, right? And anyway, for a transition toward renewable energies, we need to invest a lot of energy in order to set up the infrastructure. And apart from the energy, we need a lot of rare materials and minerals. And we are already seeing in many parts of the world many conflicts around the extraction of these materials. In terms of materials, and in terms of achieving 100% recycling, theoretically, in thermodynamic, in physical terms, is possible, but in practical terms, it's very difficult. For instance, if you look at paper, it can be recycled only a limited number of times. Glass or metals, in theory, can be recycled forever, but the problem is that you lose them in the process, right? So it's not so easy to turn our economy into a 100% circular economy. It is easier if you decrease the magnitude of your economy and then you try to reach as much as possible a circular economy. But right now, if we talk in terms of physics, in terms of thermodynamics, our economies are entropic. They are not circular. So I'm a little bit afraid that when you look at concepts like circular economy or green economy or green growth, they're basically a reincarnation of a very old idea that is the one of sustainable development, which is based on this assumption that economic growth is compatible with ecological sustainability. And I think this is not the fact. At least empirically, from the data that we have until now, there has not been dematerialization. The materialization of decoupling would be that you have the economy growing, but environmental impacts decrease. This has not happened. Can it happen in the future? Well, maybe, but the burden of proof, I don't think, stands on us, stands on the people who argue for it. And I don't see very strong arguments.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from Jill, who asks, are you noticing increasing challenges to GDP growth in mainstream media and economics? And natural capital approaches don't really challenge growth, do they? It's kind of two questions there, but related.
Yeah. No, obviously, there is more and more challenges to GDP, even from mainstream economists. There is a problem there. If you talk to any economist who is a decent economist, they would obviously agree with you that GDP is not a good indicator of welfare. They would agree that technically speaking, GDP is an indicator of economic activity in monetary terms. The problem is then that in our society, in the debates in the media, in the politics, GDP is taken as the main reference. So basically the debate is not about employment, gender equality, inequalities of poverty, it's just about how to increase GDP, hoping that it will solve all the problems. So that what I want to see is that this questioning of GDP in terms of as a metrics is not translating into political changes. This is what I'm worried about. So I had been, for instance, I remember, I think it was 2007, in a conference in the European Parliament called Beyond GDP. But since then, nothing really has happened. My point would be that the world is complex. Therefore, you cannot reduce the complexity of the world into a single unit of measure, which in this case would be money, right? Measured by GDP. We have to accept that that complexity needs to be evaluated with the multiple set of indicators, which are social, cultural, ecological, etc. And we have to deal with this complexity. And we can use, for example, multi-criteria analysis to evaluate and give a different weight to the different indicators. But we need more clever, I think, ministers and prime ministers to understand something that is more complex than GDP, that is just a simple number, right? In terms of natural capital, one problem here is that for degrowth has been very important is what we call, I think in English you say economicism. The idea that we are reducing everything to economic value and in particular to monetary value. So can we think outside economic terms? I think that is a very important aspect. Economics is a problematic discipline. In fact, economics is an invention. The fact that we think of sustainability in terms of the relationship between society, the environment, and the economy, the fact that we can separate these three spheres of society, well, obviously it's an invention. I mean, it doesn't exist. There is nothing out there that is the economy of the environment. It is all together. For instance, for ecological economists, it's not that they are related among each other, it's that the economy is embedded in the environment and it depends upon the environment. So one problem that I see also, for example, with reports on ecosystem services and all that kind of narrative is a kind of, again, a reduction of complexity into monetary values. So the idea of mainstream economists of saying the environment is not valued because it doesn't have a price, so let's put a price on the environment so that markets take it into account, I think it's a problematic idea because there are things that cannot easily be valued. So how much is my life worth? And economists would do this with different techniques. For example, looking at what is the expected salary that I can earn in my life. Then, of course, obviously, my life would be worth more than a farmer in India because I can earn more in my life as a university professor. But then do you think that my life is worth more than the one of an Indian farmer? I don't think so, you know. So these debates in terms of natural capital, monetary valuation, and so on, I think is highly problematic and has been highly criticized by ecological economics that has also put forward other valuation techniques that I think reflect better the complexity of the world.
Great, thank you so much. A quick question here from Adrian, who asks, is degrowth an appropriate name when you seem to be talking about zero growth? What's the difference between a degrowth or a zero growth approach, I suppose?
Thanks. If my responses are too long, you just tell me. Um,
Okay. We've got about
uh,
10 minutes, I think.
yeah, that's what I'm saying, the countdown. So, I mean, there have been long debates on the name because many people say, well, degrowth is it's confusing because you have to explain it, and people value growth as a positive thing, so they will immediately understand degrowth as something negative. Well, this is the point, you know. We wanted to have a provocative slogan, and therefore we want to change the social imaginary and the representation. So degrowth, we call it degrowth because because it's a provocation, right? I'm not in a degrowth society. I'm not concerned what happens to GDP, right? There are people who even propose to abolish GDP. I'm fine to keep GDP as an indicator of economic activity, being aware of its limitation. For instance, that it doesn't take into account care work because it's unpaid, right? I think degrowth has worked quite well because it sounds radical. And there is also a problem with cooptation. If you put up a nice name, it can easily be co-opted by the mainstream. So I doubt any capitalist or any mainstream institution would like to co-opt degrowth. Co-opt by meaning take it as a name and give it a different meaning because it's not a name that is so attractive. And I think in these 2 decades, it has worked quite well to bring together people interested in similar topics. However, there are people that call these in different ways. Donut Economics by Kate Rayford, Prosperity Without Growth by Tim Jackson, who has also a forthcoming book also with Polity Press, which I think is called Post Growth. There are people who talk about agrowth, so you name it. There are different options. I'm not obsessed about the name. I think in our case it worked well, but I'm open. I'm more interested about the ideas.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we've got, I think, time for 3 last questions. I think Christoph was the last person to post them. And this first one is from Beatrice, who asks, I wonder if you've explored how to approach this paradigm shift in societies where happiness relies strongly on endless consumption. What strategies could work better to persuade people to change their lifestyle?
Okay, I missed the first part of the question. Can
All
you
right.
repeat the first part? Sorry.
Yeah. Have you explored how to approach this paradigm shift in societies where currently happiness relies strongly on endless consumption, this kind of hyper consumerist societies that we live in?
I missed the happiness part. Uh, so, so well, I don't know if you have seen them, but there are lots of debates on what is called happiness economics or happiness and economics, which looks exactly, it's a literature that looks at what are the determinants of happiness or what is often called subjective well-being. So the results of these studies tell us that people's well-being really do not depend a lot on or only on income, or especially not on the increase of income. They depend on stuff like friends, family, physical activity, meaningful life, spirituality, you name it. So it's a very complex literature, I think. But there, what I think is important is that an increase in income does not necessarily lead to happier people. For example, an experiment that has been done is to look at people who win a lottery. So you would expect that people that win a lottery become much happier. But this effect on the happiness of these people lasts for a very short time because then there is a kind of a treadmill. People adapt with their expectation to the new situation, and therefore they often go back to similar level of happiness before they won the lottery or even lower. So the idea that happiness depends on consumerism, for instance, is not exactly the case. What we need to do is a cultural shift. Yes, on that I agree, and it's not easy. So we have, for example, anthropologists that have looked in different cultures how different society have lived in ways that do not depend on growth, which is basically the large part of the history of humankind, right? And in the book, we discuss this a little bit more, also how we see the coming of this cultural shift, in particular with this idea of new common senses. But of course, we have to change the social imaginary, the idea of the social representation. What is important in life? Right now, what is important in life is to find a job, get a good salary, buy a house, a car, etc., etc. That is what we have to change, and of course, it's not easy. But we do discuss in the book how we think this could be done.
Okay, great, thank you. Tom asks, last year the UK government banned teaching anti-capitalist material in school, and he asks, do you think that will impact the degrowth movement, as it seems to be forcing young people to see it as an extremist idea?
I don't know if I'm forcing young people to see it as an extreme idea, but I remember the first book that we published, which was Degrowth, a Vocabulary for a New Era. I remember that sociologist from LSE, Leslie Sclair, wrote an endorsement for our book, advising authorities to ban our book. So I wouldn't mind. I mean, um, yes, one could criticize me by saying, "Oh, you're putting this forward as too radical, you know, and this puts people away." Uh, well, as a scientist, I'm trying to put forward arguments to support my case. If this is what I see from the research that we do, I don't want to lie, you know. I just put forward what I think can be interesting, and I think students find this interesting because they often find what they are taught quite boring. So I think that people enjoy to be exposed to critical ideas, to new ideas. I'm not saying I hold the truth. I invite students to critical thinking. And I hope Degrowth can help them out to think critically about, for instance, sustainability solution. I'm not saying that our book is the Bible, but I think that it invites them to think a little bit better about what they think they know.
Yeah, that does make me wonder if there's another kind of objection that you might want to consider, which is not just that there are these various reasons why degrowth policies may be inadvisable or hard or difficult or maybe even impossible, but there's also something, and I think you've just mentioned, you alluded to with some of the response to your 2014 book, it's dangerous, right? You are meddling with forces you do not understand, right? And you risk, provoking economic systems to doing things which could be potentially disastrous. I mean, sometimes some of the discussions I have with people is that they might be sympathetic to the ideas of, yes, there must be a much more richer conception of what makes a human life worth living. But the global economic system that we have unwittingly produced, we're not necessarily in control of. But one thing that we can be sure of is that if you take away that growth, if you kind of yank growth out of the various equations by which the global economy must run, you end up with chaos, right? So really, you're a dangerous radical, Federico, because you could be unleashing, the forces of chaos on the global economy, and then we would all lose, right? So there's this dangerous element, isn't there?
No, there has been a long debate in the literature on whether degrowth is stable or unstable as a proposal. So there are different ways of tackling this. One of the things that we have been doing, and I think this was important, is that what is called now, there is like a new field emerging within ecological economics, which is called ecological macroeconomics, which is merging post-Keynesian economics with ecological economics. And we are working on models. These are macro simulation dynamic models, so that we think are better than models used by mainstream macroeconomists. If you are interested in this, you can see an article published by colleagues in Nature Sustainability, which is called Feasible Alternatives to the Green Growth. And there is also this book by the economist from Canada, Peter Victor, that is called Managing Without Growth. So obviously, yes, there is a risk, but we are not so naive. And we are doing our best to show that degrowth can be stable. There is another argument that I could add. So I've made a series of arguments of why I think we should move to an economy without growth. But there is another argument that even mainstream economies like the ones at the IMF, at the International Monetary Fund, would accept, and is the fact these debates on secular stagnation. The fact that developed economies especially are not growing as they used to be, so that we might have entered a phase of slower GDP growth. And this is true also for China and India, before the pandemic and even more right now, you know. So we are struggling for the legitimacy of the question that we ask in macroeconomics, which is, how can we manage an economy without growth? And if we think, for instance, that economies in other time of history, for example, the Chicago Boys, when they implemented neoliberal policies in Chile in the 1970s, they didn't know what would happen. So this is common. Don't think that states and economies have everything under control. They don't. And the model they use are very much limited. So I don't think we are crazier than other economists and people. Then there is another matter that is whether I think whether you think I am naive and I think this is going to be a nice walk in the countryside, in the sense it's going to be easy. No, if you touch powers and their privileges, of course you're going to get a lot of opposition. So I get threats, even life threats, but I got used to it, and this is part of our struggle. So there are different people who like the history of humankind is a history, in my understanding, of emancipation. So I think the struggle for degrowth or for environmental sustainability is part of the struggle, and it's not going to be easy. uh, we published a piece in an article in Global Environmental Change, looking at trying to explain why environmental defenders are getting killed around the world. And there are hundreds of people that get killed every year for defending the environment. So these people are putting at risk their life, but they're doing it because they are fighting for the environment and they're fighting for environmental justice. So I think degrowth is the proposal that we can put forward in Europe, in the global north, to defend the environmental justice around the world. This at least is how far as we have got, with all our limitations and vulnerabilities.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end today's seminar, because we have run just a little bit over time. But if you'd just like to join me in saying thank you to Federico again, that was fantastic talk. Thank you so much for your questions. And thank you, Federico, for your answers. Of course, Federico's far too modest to put a link to his book, which I have just done on the chat. So if anything, if any of that sounds interesting, you might want to learn more, you might want to strongly disagree, I thoroughly recommend their new book. It's a fantastic introduction, as well as an opportunity to explore much deeper into what is an issue that I think has only become more and more important, perhaps for some of the reasons that Federico's just outlined. Well, thank you